All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, crowd, for early Monday morning. I really appreciate you all being here. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation. We're a 100-year-old public policy think tank based here in Washington, focused exclusively on transportation. And I'm really happy to welcome you to this important event, U.S. Spectrum Allocation Needs Reform, Lessons from the C-Band Controversy. This event is being jointly sponsored by ENO and ITIF, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. My personal thanks to ITIF and the whole team for all the heavy lifting that you've done on this project. This discussion is a direct output of a really great partnership between ENO and ITIF to look at the way the federal government allocates spectrum. As we all know, the rollout of the 5G band proved to be a real kind of global embarrassment for the United States. Specifically, the aviation industry just disagreed with the FCC's allocation of C-band because of their own safety concerns. The FAA warned that the planes would have to be grounded as a result. So fortunately, in 2022, in January, the telecommunications and aviation sectors came together at an 11th hour compromise and agreed to a modified rollout. We all remember what happened in the news. While the crisis was temporarily averted, it was clear that we really did need to figure out better improvements in the process for allocating spectrum and to make sure that this doesn't happen again, because at least in the transportation industry, this is going to keep coming up, not just for aviation, but for surface transportation as well. So recognizing that recommendations between or with the two sectors coming together was going to have much more impact than just the sectors alone, we partnered with ITIF. We're really, really happy that they agreed to work with us on this and all the work that they did. We created a joint working group filled with experts from aviation, telecommunications, the spectrum allocation process, and came together to help inform a report that we released 3 weeks ago now, which is available on ITIF's website. Today's event is designed to discuss that report and engage in a panel discussion with all of the experts. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Joe Kane, who is the brains behind the operation, is going to moderate a panel of experts. We'll introduce those in a second. But first, it's my honor to introduce Scott Blake. He is a senior spectrum advisor of the Office of the Assistant Secretary at NTIA. He's going to make some remarks, and then he will take questions. And we're also taking questions for folks online. So go ahead and send those in electronically. Thanks very much.
So thank you to ITF and ENO for inviting me here today. There is nothing I like to do more than talk about C-band and altimeters. That is the only fib I'm going to tell this morning. So I read the ITF ENO report with interest, as did my colleagues at NTIA. But with your indulgence, I'd like to begin this morning by going in a somewhat different direction. And the reason for that is that we recently at NTIA, last Wednesday, released an RFC to kick off the creation of a national spectrum strategy. I will come back to the report because our national spectrum strategy and the report that was done are not unrelated. So last Wednesday, we released this RFC asking stakeholders, meaning pretty much everyone, for input on a national spectrum strategy. We also noticed 2 public listening sessions, one in March, one in April. And while this is something of an oversimplification, our RFC has 3 basic components. The first seeks input on which spectrum bands deserve in-depth study for more intensive use by both the private sector and by federal agencies. Our goal is to identify at least, and I underscore at least, 1,500 megahertz of spectrum for intensive study to see whether they can be repurposed. Repurposed for these purposes means more use or different use than those bands are currently being used for today. The second section focuses on the spectrum planning process. How can we better ensure more open, productive, and consistent discussions among federal agencies and between the private sector and federal agencies? The ITF-ENO paper touches on many of the questions we've posed in this section of our RFC. The third section focuses on how technology, current or future, can be used to permit more intensive spectrum use. If you look at the RFC, you may note that many of the questions are somewhat open-ended. We do not identify specific bands for comment. We do not suggest the proper licensing framework for specific bands or even for specific situations. And with one exception, we don't call out any particular technology approach. This wasn't an accident, nor does it suggest we don't have our own ideas on these subjects. Rather, we made a conscious decision that we did not wish to channel the discussion into one path or another based on our preconceived notions. We did not want to put our thumb on the scale, encouraging or discouraging particular approaches. We actually hoped to encourage a full public discussion that was not centered on our thinking, but on the thinking of stakeholders. In any case, I hope we will get robust public comment, robust public interest, and lots of ideas which are not already in our heads about spectrum allocation going forward. So let me turn for a second from the RFC to the issues about C-band and altimeters, and shall we say the suboptimal way in which this was all handled. The good news is that having stared into the abyss, or having arguably fallen into the abyss, literally no one wants to do this again. It was a teaching experience for everybody involved. And a few things, good things, have come out of this unfortunate situation. First, all of the parties involved have spent quality time together over the last year or so. Answers to the technical concerns have been developed, and while the story is not yet complete and no one is entirely happy, I think we're in a very good place. We are certainly in a better place than we expected to be at this time last year. So it turns out that by testing, study, and the exchange of data and follow-up discussion, spectrum problems can in fact be resolved. They need not be a zero-sum game. And it turns out it wasn't a zero-sum game in this case. The bottom line is that C-band networks and altimeters can safely coexist with the appropriate mitigation measures in place. Ideally, of course, one figures this out at the beginning of the process and not at the end of the process. And going forward, that's the goal. Second, the agencies involved, and even agencies that weren't involved and just watched this from afar, realize that better coordination is necessary going forward. Well before I got to NTIA, the Commission and our agency signed a new memorandum of understanding governing their working relationship to reduce the likelihood of these kinds of misunderstandings recurring. And I have to say, having been more or less involved in this area since 1994, I cannot think of a time when there was a better working relationship between the FCC and NTIA than there is now. But to be clear, we are not yet done addressing these concerns. We are still involved in discussions, both within the executive branch and with the Commission, to make sure the kind of disconnect we saw on C-band can never happen again. And of course, we've made coordination issues of this kind a significant part of our RFC, and they will be part of our national spectrum strategy. Finally, turning to some of the specifics of the ITF-ENO report. First, I have to say you had a great team of people working on it. And not to put too fine a point on it, two of the authors and two of your panelists this morning, Tom and Larry, are among my oldest friends in Washington. And by the way, I do not mean my longest standing friends. I mean, objectively, my oldest friends. Recognizing that not all drafters of the report agreed with everything in it, I thought its description of the spectrum allocation process and the gaps in that process were pretty good. And I think the work that we have been doing, some of which is public, some of which is not yet public, will address many, if not all, of the gaps that were identified in this report. The report noted, for example, a degradation of trust among the agencies. Building trust is, of course, a process, and it's way easier to destroy trust than it is to build it. But we are spending lots of time repairing relationships among the federal agencies, and I believe we are getting back to what some might describe as regular order. The report also noted a lack of executive branch support for the views of NTIA. I think that concern is not unrelated to the concern about a lack of trust. And I am betting that addressing one issue will help with the other. And again, I think we are making steady progress, real progress. The report noted a concern about the Commission not sufficiently engaging with other agencies. I think the NTIA, FCC, MOU, and the way it has been implemented has addressed this concern. Because of the revised MOU, the Commission through NTIA is engaging with other agencies much earlier and more often. I see this on a daily basis or a weekly basis, but all the time. The report also noted a concern about the failure to update standards for RF devices. I think it's a really interesting issue, but we have asked questions about it in the RFC, and I'm interested to see what stakeholders have to say about that one. The bottom line on process is that I hope when we release our spectrum strategy later this year, the authors of the report will think we have addressed each and every one of the gaps identified. And the bottom line on substance is that when it comes to spectrum allocation decisions, going forward, there should be no more surprises, there should be no more misunderstandings, and there should be no more decisions without all the information that decision makers need. That's when it went off the rails with C-band. So thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and I'd be happy to take a few questions, and with a little luck, I might even have a few answers. Thank you. Questions? Well, that's easy. Monday morning, you know, Joe.
So
By the way, before you ask your question, so there's nothing like getting a new job. You're there not very long and the phone rings and it's Joe Kane on the phone. Scott, you got a moment? Sure, why? Well, we're studying how your agency screwed up and I'd like your thoughts on it. Thank you, Joe, for that.
Thank you for your thoughts on it. So I think that this is the RFC is a really good step, and I think that you said it's looking at about a 10-year time horizon.
Just to be clear, we're looking at short, medium, and long term. I don't want anyone to think, oh, gee, nothing we're talking about is going to be relevant for a decade. I hope that's not true. We are looking at things we can do in a 2-year time frame, and a 5-year time frame, and we're also looking at a decade. And the theory is, whatever debates we're having now, we don't want to have the same debates every year for the next 10 years. We like to get a plan in place that people can feel comfortable with, both now and going forward for a bit.
Yeah, and so I guess.
And now I'll let you actually ask your question.
I think that's very helpful. And then, so what happens after 10 years? Is to say, every 10 years we do another national.
Well, I actually think that makes some fair degree of sense because, the world changes in a decade or so, and arguably less than that. Look, it is Monday morning. I don't need questions. It's okay. But if there are any others, I'm happy to take them. Okay. You guys are a great audience. Thank you.
Swap out name tags here. All right. So we're now going to move into a panel discussion that's going to cover some of the things Scott talked about, and then some of the other things in the report and what happened with the C-band proceeding. I would encourage everyone who is watching online to submit questions there's a link both on the ITIF website and on the YouTube channel that you can click to type in your question, and I will be monitoring those on here, and I will pass those along to the panelists. We'll have also questions from the room are encouraged. I'll start by introducing our panelists and then sort of go into the discussion here. So starting on my right, we have Jennifer Holder, who is the Director of Aviation and Safety Regulatory Affairs at Boeing. We have Tom Power, who is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CTIA. And to my left, Larry Strickling, who is the former Assistant Secretary for Commerce and Information, which is the NTIA Administrator at the U.S. Department of Commerce. So just a little background. Rob said a little bit about how we actually got here in this C-band proceeding. For those who are maybe not as initiated in what happened, I will give a very, very brief rundown. So in 2020, the Federal Communications Commission decided to reallocate the C-band from satellite use to allow mobile services there. There were some concerns from the aviation industry who operate in the band just above those satellites, who has said maybe this is going to cause problems with our altimeters. The Federal Communications Commission brought in those comments. They came out with a plan that they said, we think will protect altimeters. The aviation industry and the FAA disagreed with that, and that sort of disagreement sort of bubbled along under the surface until it came to a head in November, December of 2021, and that's how we ended up getting in a situation where maybe flights will be grounded, maybe we'll have to delay 5G deployment, and we ended up with some voluntary mitigation measures that the wireless carriers agreed to say we will turn down our power specifically around some airports, and that the aviation industry will over time upgrade its altimeters so that they will be capable of operating within that new interference environment. That's very broad strokes. I'm sure that I might get corrections from either side on that as we go. But I just want to sort of set the stage for where we're going with this now. Maybe start with you, Jennifer, tell us about what are these radio altimeters? How do they work? Like, why are they the issue in this proceeding?
Yeah. So good morning, Jennifer Holder from Boeing. So the radio altimeter. So let me start out by saying I'm an engineer, 15 years and in the Puget Sound area, and then I moved here. 5G was probably the third biggest thing that I worked by sequence timing. So a little bit about radio altimeters. On the airplane, this is the device that's going to give situational awareness to the pilot as far as how far above the ground they are. So it's particularly important on takeoff and on landing, and particularly on landing, the radio altimeter, especially when the pilots are using what we call precision approach. So they're using guidance to bring them in. Even if they're hand flying, they're still seeing something in the flight deck that's giving them. We call it a vector. I'm trying to use better words, but that's trying to bring them in. And so really it's in a clear day where you can see the runway. You don't have any obstacles, right? And an obstacle would be a tower, a mountain, right? I mean, things like that. That's not exactly where the concerns are. The concerns are when you are what we call in the soup. When there's you're coming down and you're going to break out of the clouds at 200 feet. You can't see in other words, you can't see the runway until you are 200 feet above the ground. That radio altimeter provides the pilots with situational awareness. And so our concern with the radio altimeters as a flight critical, it gives a flight critical piece of information to the pilots. And so what we get concerned about with 5G interference or interference in general is that the pilots lose situational awareness. And so when you look at accident reports over the last since ground proximity warning system was implemented, when you look at accident reports, loss of situational awareness or controlled flight into terrain is one of the leading causes of accidents. And so that is what really got us going when it came from a Boeing perspective. When it was brought to our attention that, 5G, there could be an interference, the radio altimeters weren't fully protected, we really started to worry about that type of aspect.
Mm-hmm. And can you just talk a little bit about why this was a change from how the band below the altimeter band was before, and talk about why that made a difference?
Yeah, and this was news to me when I was first made aware of this project or this issue. So the radio altimeter band is protected, so nothing else can operate in that band. And then I think with very good intentions, the FCC has a barrier between the C-band and the radio altimeter band on either above or below. The thing that I didn't realize as and this is just me personally, as we were starting to work this project, was that with specific power levels, the there could be interference in the radio altimeter band because of and to be fair, not my area of expertise. If you want to know about safety analysis and how pilots deal with failures, that's me. But I'll try to explain to you how I understood it to be, which is power levels in the specific, especially as you get higher into that band and closer to the radio altimeter band, means that you could have seepage, right? You could have things that are sort of like creeping into that our radio altimeters might listen to. When our radio altimeters are listening to something that is not the radio altimeter signal, right? That's not a good thing. And so that was our concern, right? Is that the power levels, when our very smart engineers did some math, they discovered that there might be interference. And in the aviation industry, we don't deal in mites. You have to prove it's safe. So that's one of those things that when things might happen, we have to go do an analysis to ensure its safety, which is, I think, a different approach than what other industries have.
Yeah, thank you. So, Tom, your members are trying to operate in the band below the altimeter band. You talked a little bit about like how that relates to what Jennifer was saying, and what is this C-band we hear about? Why is it important? And how does it relate to altimeters in your view?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me here, Joe, and ITIF, and good morning, everyone. So the C-band is the band of spectrum from, not to get too in the weeds already, from 3.7 gigahertz to 4.2 gigahertz. It is in what we call mid-band spectrum. We sort of divide things up between low band, mid-band, and high band. I know a lot of you know this, but the big difference being low band is what the original cellular networks were based on, the big towers sending signals out for miles and miles, especially suited for voice and texting, which are kind of low capacity applications. When you get into real mobile broadband and the higher capacity uses, it's not as robust. High band at the other extreme is really good at that, very robust, very low latency. The challenge there being that the high band frequencies just don't travel as far. And so the C-band is in the mid band, which is, and I'm not the first one to say it, the Goldilocks band, because it combines the best of both of those. And so there was a lot of interest in our community to freeing up mid-band spectrum, not just the C-band, but the larger mid-band spectrum. And this band was identified as potentially being available. And it is really important for the nation in terms of the economy and productivity and jobs that we find opportunities, particularly in mid-band spectrum. China is certainly doing it. They are ahead of us in mid-band, as some other countries. We're trying to replicate what we saw in 4G, which was where the U.S. was the leader, and not just in getting broadband out to Americans, but a lot of the spillover effects. So the operating systems that's an American-dominated industry. The app economy is an American-dominated industry, and it has spillover effects in all sorts of other industries. So we're trying to replicate that in mid-band and in 5G in particular. So that's why C-band was important. And as Jennifer said, as the issue unfolded, these issues started to develop, and there was disagreement about some of the technical assumptions and all that. But I'd say for now, the good news is the working relationships have been established. The wireless industry has put into effect certain mitigations, particularly around airports. We're not done with the process yet, but we're in a whole lot better place, as Scott said earlier, than we were a year and a half ago, especially.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking of Scott, that brings us to NTIA, which is Larry is the former head of that agency. Can you give us a little overview of how NTIA plays into this kind of process? Not specifically, I know you weren't there at the time for this, but what's NTIA's role in this?
Sure. Well, thanks, Joe. And first, I'd like to thank ITIF and Eno and Joe in particular for this study and inviting folks like me and Tom and Jennifer to participate in the providing advisory advice to the study as they conducted their work. This is one, I think, in a series of very important spectrum studies that ITIF has released over the last few years. And so it's good to see the active role that ITIF has, in particular, has taken on spectrum issues more generally. I would just start by saying that the issues presented by the C-band controversy are somewhat unique in the sense that it's not typically what's involved with spectrum reallocation as practiced on a day-to-day basis inside NTIA. NTIA's role is to manage the use of spectrum by federal agencies. The FCC, as a separate independent regulatory agency, has the responsibility to manage the use of spectrum by the commercial industry, as well as by state and local governments. So it's a two-part process in terms of how the spectrum's managed. Typically for NTIA, and I think it was pointed out in the GAO study last year, handles about 90,000 requests from federal agencies for spectrum assignments in a year. So that's the bulk of the work. It's really one federal agency saying, we would like to use this part of the spectrum. The geography of the use is very important. The time of day of the use is very, very important. And there is a well-established process inside NTIA by which those requests from federal agencies are handled at an administrative level, fairly low level. Few of those types of requests ever make it up to the front office at NTIA. They're handled through expert people in not just NTIA, but in also each of the federal agencies that use spectrum. And over years, that's worked pretty well. That's not the C-band case. In the C-band case, what you have here is a question of an existing use of the spectrum by the altimeters, and then the idea of bringing in a commercial service in bands that are nearby to the band that's currently being used by the FAA and by the airlines. So there wasn't any question here about putting a new service into the band that was being used by the industry. It was a question of the extent to which the 5G service could coexist with the altimeter service. That's a fairly unique question. It doesn't come up all that often. And what it requires in those situations is an effort to understand all of the equities of the agencies that might be affected by this, determining what position the United States government should take in response to that, because at the White House level, they're balancing the importance of more spectrum for the commercial industry to allow a critically important technology, 5G, to expand and to allow the U.S. to become leaders in that area, against the equally important issue of we can't have airplanes falling out of the sky because their altimeters are being interfered with. That really is this issue that in these kinds of situations needs to be coordinated at the White House level, at the interagency level, in order to make sure that all the equities are out and that the United States government can then make a position that balances those interests and comes up with the approach that best meets the needs of both of those sets of equities. That's what didn't happen well in this particular case. But it really has to happen at that level, and in order to come up with an outcome that, as I say, takes all those equities of the different agencies into account and comes up with the best solution. NTIA then, in its role as the advisor to the president on communications issues, would take that position and present it as the administration's position to the FCC. That's also a breakdown we've seen in the last several years where because the White House perhaps wasn't taking as directive a position as it needed to take to bring the disparate interests together. You had agencies thinking that it was up to them to take their equities and their issues directly to the FCC, which also is a recipe for confusion, if not disaster, because the United States government really ought to be speaking with one voice at the point at which it's presenting these issues to the FCC. But again, this is kind of a unique situation. They don't arise that often. Before the altimeter issues, we certainly had the issues of GPS and its equities versus the interests of Light Squared, later Legato, to build a cellular network nearby the GPS. And it raised a lot of these same issues, but I think there was a lot more collaboration, a lot more involvement, and a lot more direct engagement by the White House in those issues that, for whatever reason, we really didn't see for the time period in which this issue became so important. So I think typically spectrum allocation works really, really well for the most part. But when you get into these really, really important issues that have severe consequences for different parties, it requires a little more coordination, a little more opportunity to get the issues on the table and resolved at a interagency level to avoid the kind of controversy and disappointments that the Altimeter controversy created.
Yeah, thank you. I think, in the federal agency world for this proceeding, obviously the most important one is the FAA. And so I wonder if, Jennifer, I can ask you how the FAA develops its safety and technical standards. Like, what role does the industry play in that, and how can that inform the NTIA process that Larry was talking about?
Yeah, so the standards making process is kind of interesting. I was thinking about how would I describe this on the way here, and I was thinking about my iPhone, right? So touch screens on the iPhone. You may not know that touch screens on a Boeing jet are first being implemented now, right? But how long have you had an iPhone? How long have you been using a touch screen? And one of the reasons for that is the standards process within the aviation industry. It takes a long time. The work through, generally, we like to work through ICAO, or we like to have directives from ICAO. We like to have things that are, sorry, ICAO, it's the it's Aviation Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, I think is what it stands for. It's the, basically, it's the organization that we work with across the entire world for aviation standards. So things like the carbon emissions standard that came out in 2016. We're currently working on pilot training standards, right? In the United States, it's, we have our own, and then in Europe, they have their own, at the EU, right? So each individual state has their own. So should that be standardized? So generally, we hope for direction. And sometimes we don't get it, right? Sometimes it's something that a new technology is starting to be made. And so an organization like RTCA or the SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, will say, okay, we need to go create a standard for this because we're going to go put this on an airplane before ICAO or the FAA or EASA, who's the European Union safety agency, before they can even get to the point of creating a regulation. And so I would say that's pretty much how it goes, right? Is that there's a technology that's developed, it's technology that's available. Your cell phone has so much capability right now. When you look at that, and when you look at microprocessors and microchips, and how are we going to go put that onto an aircraft without a regulation? A lot of the ways that we do that is we do it under special condition, and then after we've done it, we or in the process of doing it, we work with these organizations, these standards creating organizations that I would say quite typically are outside the FAA. And then the FAA adopts those standards, or EASA adopts those standards in the case of, because most of these agencies are working across international space, right? Boeing, Airbus, we go with the same standards for compliance activities for the most part.
Yeah, so does that affect the ability of the FAA to give input to NTIA if there's sort of this, I don't know, industry to FAA back and forth going on for a while before NTIA makes?
Yeah, so I mean, and especially in the case of 5G, I think there's some role that the FAA needs to play to anticipate. So if the FCC comes out with, hey, we want to go do 5G, 6G, 7G, whatever it is, I think there are some things that we need to be doing as an industry, as an aviation industry, to anticipate those changes. I'm not sure that we are in a position to do that. I think we, and like everybody else, we've got shortages, employee shortages. We had a whole bunch of retirements over the last 2 to 3 years. And so just the ability to be proactive and to go have those like thought-provoking strategic conversations has been a challenge, right? Because we've got, I'm sure all of you guys have this problem too, right? You've got so much work in front of you to get done in the next 3 months that it's really hard to think of, okay, well, how am I going to go be that proactive and come up with this is what the things are. I do think there needs to be an input process for especially around spectrum, the spectrum management plan. I'm looking forward to actually having a good spectrum management plan because GPS, radio altimeters, our traffic collision and avoidance system, fixing or implementing new technologies for FAA Next Gen and ATC, all of those things need to be addressed, and we don't want to have what happened for 5G happen again. So whether that's a standards making on our side, making the airplane robust, one of the ways we can do is we can just protect the airplane for all electromagnetic and all radio frequencies, right? We can just try to make it that robust. But then I have a sustainability problem because I just added a whole bunch of metal and shielding to the airplane. And so we have to go find that happy medium. And the only way we do that is by working together.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Tom, your comments on any of that, but I'd also like to ask you to put your former job hat on and talk about the role of the White House in all this.
Yeah, let me touch on two important things that Jennifer pointed to and how they relate. She mentioned earlier about, as she described it, our 5G transmission is going to be seeping in, I think was the technical term used, into altimeters. From our perspective, we might put it differently and say, is the altimeter eavesdropping on our spectrum?
That's fair.
And that's just a gray area that is the physics of it, right? And then the second point is the product cycle, right? Apple has probably come up with 2 new iPhones since we've been here this morning. The airline cycle is much longer than that, and I put those two together because our view is that some of these altimeters were just poorly designed, but the design was decades ago,
Right.
And at the time there was no 5G in the C-band, so why not? They would be cheaper to produce that way and less of an encumbrance, less of a burden. There was nobody that you had to worry about next door. And in all fairness, they're not going to be thinking, well, maybe 30, 40 years from now, somebody's going to be coming in there. So there are these trade-offs you have to make. And I think now, though, as the spectrum becomes more and more crowded, we all do have to be more thoughtful and more proactive on it. But it's not an easy answer when, as Jennifer said, in that industry, it's a much longer cycle to be doing upgrades, and you can't. These are usually existing aircraft that last for a long time and that need to be upgraded, so they're literally on the ground. Apple can go crank out a new iPhone. All of our iPhones are still working while they're cranking out the new one. To your point, Joe, and just for context, in a prior life, I was at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House as Deputy CTO. Larry was at NTIA at the time. And as Larry alluded to, the White House can play a very important role here. I felt like at the time we had issues like this. They didn't develop in the same way. We managed to work our way through them. I felt my role in the White House was to convene folks. I think I was the least technically knowledgeable, proficient person in the room, but Larry had a great team at NTIA. The Defense Department was the agency we were more concerned about given the spectrum bands we were looking at back then. But we had some great folks over there. The Office of Management and Budget was very involved, and of course the FCC. And we would just get in the room together when these issues arose, and I could pull people together. I had to count on them to solve the problems. But that convening role, and Larry alluded to this, is really the important role that the White House can play. And I like not to pat ourselves too much on the back, but I like to think that we actually managed to get ahead of some of those problems, and with the help of a lot of really smart people, solved them in a way that somehow didn't happen here, and we didn't start solving the problems until after the spectrum had been auctioned.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So we've sort of done NTIA, White House, FAA. I think we should talk a bit about the FCC since we're talking about spectrum. Tom, maybe this would be good for you. Just like, how does the FCC make its decision as it did in the C-band proceeding? Like, what are the protection measures that it put in place Like, who does it listen to when it's making those decisions?
So in a situation like this, the FCC proceeds as they do in most areas of their regulatory approach, which is a rulemaking proceeding under the Administrative Procedures Act, where they put out for public comment what they're proposing to do, what they're thinking about doing. They get public comment in, and then they go through all of the issues. Obviously, for today's purposes, we're talking about a lot of these technical issues, but there are other issues involved too. The auction process itself can be done in different ways, so they take comment on that. And in this case, the incumbents who had been in the band previously were satellite providers. Given the nature of their services, they did not raise any of the interference concerns that we saw later. But they were going to have to shrink their occupancy of the band in order to allow the introduction of mobile broadband. And so the question was, how's that going to work? There was actually a lot of the auction proceeds that the wireless carriers bid went directly to the satellite providers to help not only compensate them, but to also expedite their ability to shrink themselves in the footprint. So all of this goes through this rulemaking process. Typically, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking, comments and reply comments. It's not uncommon for the FCC to put out a couple other public notices when they identify another issue that they want a little more specific comment on. And then there are filings that can go on outside of the formal comment process where folks can come in and meet with the FCC or make subsequent submissions. And then the FCC, their job is to put it all together and get to the right answer. It is a challenging and can be a complex process, but the FCC, they are really the experts on this. Spectrum auctions were first introduced in the early 90s. They had been sort of laughed at as an allocation process in decades earlier. They've proven unbelievably successful. The rest of the world has now copied us in terms of adopting that as the best method of allocating spectrum. But it really counts on the personnel and the strength of the FCC, and they've got some great folks.
Should we renew auction authority?
Sure.
Okay. Have to throw in a plug for that, right?
Yeah. So some of you may know, if you're following this, after 30 years of leading the world in spectrum auctions and hundreds of billions of dollars in proceeds to the Treasury, hundreds of billions of dollars of capital investment, trillions of dollars of GDP, millions of jobs, we don't have spectrum auction authority anymore. It lapsed last week, 2 weeks ago, and we need to get that fixed. This C-band issue has obviously been challenging, but it really is a small bump in the road compared to what we're facing if we don't restore spectrum auction authority. I alluded to earlier, China has outpaced us when it comes to mid-band spectrum. They have plans to do even more. We're struggling to catch up. We need auction authority to get there.
Fair points. Jennifer, I would give you the right to respond on the FCC proceeding. I know as the industry that maybe didn't get what it wanted to the same degree. Any comment on how that works or worked in the past?
So similarly, when an NPRM comes out, we have a process, an internal, this is Boeing perspective, we have an internal process to review notice of proposed rulemaking that may have an impact on the aviation industry, in particular Part 25, transport category jets, that's us, or the operation space therein. And so I would say from our perspective, we have a very small team of people that review spectrum management and review auctions, looking for potential for issues within our authority. The legato issue is near and dear to my team's heart, for sure. And I think that, over the years, it does feel like we've had to play defense on spectrum auctions and that type of thing. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, that just is how it feels from a Boeing perspective. It doesn't mean that we can't change it either and have a better capability of, okay, the NPRM comes out, you get 30 to 90 days, depending on what it is, to evaluate. It is incredibly challenging to evaluate whether or not you have a safety of flight issue in a 30 to 90 day time period. And I think that from the perspective of putting out that NPRM and the ability to comment, now I don't remember off the top of my head because it's been about a year since I've read it, but I don't remember if we commented originally on the original NPRM. I think we did and said we have a concern. And then we had the RTCA study that was done in a lab that showed that in the lab environment that there can be, I like how you said it, right? You know, we say it's seeped into the band, and the cellular companies say that the radio altimeters are listening when they shouldn't. So, you know, I think whether or not however you want to write it, there was a problem with interference, and I think we knew that. And I think we actually filed an ex parte. We did an ex parte filing after one of our meetings, and I just feel like people weren't talking to each other. So this specific NPRM, you know, it was almost like a thank you for your comments type of response, and so I think that was, you know, awful frustrating for us as knowing that we didn't have really the capability to manage aviation safety in the way that we wanted to have that capability to manage. And maybe that's selfish on my part to say it that way, but that's certainly from an internal, like the person who was leading the internal team and response, and how were we going to address these concerns, trying to come up with ways to do that at the end of 2021. You know, I really wish that the NPRM process had worked when we raised the concern that we had some aviation safety concerns. How we go do that, the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction over airplanes, right? So, you know, I think that's something that has to be resolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess that sort of necessarily leads into talking a little bit about the receivers on the airplanes, and whether, you know, I think it does matter for regulatory purposes whether it is the receivers listening outside of their band or the 5G services transmitting into the altimeter band. Do you think that that's something that the FCC should regulate? I know they have a notice of inquiry out on this saying, you know, should we make rules for how the altimeters have to work so that we don't end up in a situation where maybe, if Tom's right, we have these receivers that are out there that are listening far too broadly and causing problems for us.
I was actually just going to say, I'm like, crap, I just asked for another federal agency to oversee us. No, no, that's not what I meant. You know, I find it difficult. I mean, I've only been in the DC area for 2.5 years. Again, you know, I'm an airplane design engineer. That's my background. And so policy, I'm learning more about it. As far as I really do honestly think that a standard is the right way to go here, right? We need to, we have a fun word that we use in Boeing, robustify. We do need to identify the specific flight critical systems that need to be, that now and in the future need to have some sort of risk mitigation put in place. This is one of the great things about the safety management system that has been in place at airlines. Now we're working on putting it into place at the OEMs, so original manufacturer, aircraft manufacturer, where, and this is what we did with 5G. We're like, okay, we have a new threat that's coming into our environment. GPS spoofing is another one, right? That's a new threat that's coming into the environment, something that 30 years ago we didn't think about when we were designing the radio altimeters. And so that whole process gives us a way to organize our thoughts around how do we change our approach to, say, radio altimeters. So we do have some ways, I think, within the industry. It just doesn't move as fast as I think anybody in the telecom industry wants us to move. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, I think that's...
don't want FCC overseeing us. FAA is good.
Would you say that, like, those standards should be updated more often than the lifetime of an airplane, potentially?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, of course I would. Yes.
Because it seems like it has safety implications, right? Like, it's not just a matter of, do we let 5G work? It's also, if there are these devices out there that can take down airplanes, we should like want the airplanes
Well,
to like
yeah,
update it as
absolutely.
quickly as possible. right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
again, sometimes the technology on the airplane is going to outpace the standard being updated, right?
Mhm.
So I would say that Boeing is often on the forefront because we are the, we're the biggest of the jets here, US state of design. So I would say Boeing and Airbus are often on the flight safety critical items on the forefront. And then there's other things that general aviation is very much more on the forefront, like touch screens being implemented in the flight deck, right? That's something that you can get on your GA jet today that you wouldn't be able, you can't quite have on your Boeing jet today. So we are a big industry, right?
Yeah.
So, and some of the conversations between the, on all of the 5G issues, you're going to get a different perspective from someone from Boeing versus maybe even someone from Textron or other, not calling out Textron on purpose, right? But I mean, I'm trying to think of a GA. I used to work at Beechcraft. So when I think about, you're going to get a different opinion from me as a former Beechcraft engineer as you are from a Boeing engineering perspective.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Larry, I wonder if I could go to you on the question of receivers. I know NTIA filed in the FCC receiver standards notice of inquiry proceeding, and I think they said like we kind of do a little bit of regulation of receivers already. But and this goes to, there was a question that came in online asking, should NTIA be doing sort of a parallel proceeding for all the federal receivers?
So I think the issue of regulating receivers has been an issue that's been kicking around for a long, long time. It was a huge issue as part of the GPS issues related to light squared / legato. It's obviously emerged again here. And I think it was long overdue for the FCC to bring forward the proceeding that they launched in the last year or two to take a look at this. And I think within the federal government, since they're largely looking at devices that are manufactured by industry, I think it's fine for NTIA to be looking at this and providing guidance to federal agencies, but it may well be that the issues that are raised by receivers purchased by federal agencies may be the same issues that get addressed in the FCC proceeding. But it's an important inquiry, definitely needs to be looked at. But if we could, maybe I'd like to step back a little bit and just kind of comment on what I've been hearing from our panelists so far. I think that one of the key things that emerges from here is industry and agencies need to have as much advance notice as possible in terms of what bans are coming up for these kinds of discussions, for making them, reallocating them to industry, particularly for mass market services like 5G. So they need to have the time, and they need to be able to assess what of their equities are at stake from what is possibly coming down the road. So to this extent, I really applaud the NTIA RFC because it's bringing back a notion that we had several years ago, but I think may have fallen by the wayside, which is the idea of the spectrum pipeline. There ought to be, for the industry's benefit, for agencies' benefit, everybody ought to know these are the 1,500 megahertz or whatever of spectrum that are being considered for possible reallocation or repurposing. And at that point, when that's out there and people know that those are in the pipeline, it doesn't necessarily mean that something's going to happen to them, but at least it tells everybody these are the bands that we want to focus on. This is where we want to conduct our studies. This is where we need to identify the equities that everybody has so that there's no surprises at the end. Because I think if I'm right, and don't hold me to this, that when the FCC decides to do an auction, I think they only have to give 18 months notice of the auction. At that point, it's too late to do a lot of this work because it needs to have been done before then. Get the equities assessed, figure out, and if you can, agree on the studies that ought to be conducted, because we have competing studies on interference just the same way you have competing studies on just about any other matter of controversy, because one person's interference standard may not be another person's. And so, and there isn't like one standard out there that everybody agrees upon. Aha, if you impact at that level, we consider that harmful interference. That does not exist. And so you'll have industry presenting studies that say there's no problem here, there's no interference, but on the same data, the government agency or another set of interests may say, wait a second, that's going to potentially cause interference to us. We have to be concerned about it. So getting those parties together early on to design and conduct studies is really, really important so that everybody has a shared base of here's the information that's going to go into making the decision. And we all agree in terms that this is what the data shows. And then the other piece of it that really at the end of the day, because maybe the most important question is, okay, so now you've discovered there's a problem. There needs to be a retrofit or development of new technology. Who's going to have the burden of doing that and who's going to pay for it? Because at the end of the day, that's a lot of what this comes down to is who's going to write the check. Well, with all the spectrum proceeds, the money is there. Then the question is, if you can identify early on who's impacted and where the equities lie, you can early on say, okay, airline industry, here's a fund of money to go in and upgrade altimeters over the next number of years. You still have the issue of the timeline involved in that because, as Tom mentioned, the airlines they're not changing out gear as fast as Apple's putting out new iPhones. But you can still address the question of who's going to end up having to bear the financial burden of this and get that settled early on so that people can develop plans to do this. So I think with the NTIA having a spectrum plan, having a pipeline, again, having an inventory, these are all things that existed not that long ago, but I think have fallen by the wayside. It's great to see NTIA taking leadership on this issue again and getting that information out there so that people can organize and as Jennifer mentioned, doing the risk assessment for their particular technologies. It'll be much better if they can do that in the context of having good information as to what's really at stake.
Yeah, that's really great. You're singing the song of our paper that came out. So hopefully everyone will read that and agree with Larry all the more. Larry, can I ask your opinion on Spectrum Relocation Fund and whether that's we talked about paying for it, that's sort of paying for it in terms of federal users. Do you think there should be reforms made to that to make it more flexible?
Well, I think, and I think, again, I'll be trumpeting another paper you all wrote, which is that, and I understand why the law was written the way it was written, because the way it's written now, so that people know, is that federal agencies can get reimbursed for making changes in their equipment in order to deal with spectrum relocation. Now that I think was written in the context of where you are moving federal systems out of a band to clear a band for commercial use potentially. And so the question was, well, wait a second, our gear won't work in the band you're going to assign us to. Who's going to pay for that? So the Spectrum Relocation Fund said, as long as the equipment that you're going to acquire has comparable capabilities to what you had, no gold plating, no, taking advantage of the technological progress that probably had occurred from the time that the original equipment had been purchased, the federal agency could be reimbursed for that. I think we need a broader vision of that in terms of how to reimburse not just federal agencies, but also industry, and allow them to take advantage of the benefits of new technology, so that instead of just relegating people to the same characteristics of equipment that they maybe had that needed to be modified, give them a chance to take advantage of the efficiencies and the benefits of new technology, instead of handcuffing them to only acquire something that basically performs the same task that they had before. I think I understand why they had that. But I think in today's era of rapid technological change, that's an outdated provision and really ought to be changed, as well as, I think, encouraging through this process of identifying the costs early on, the idea of reimbursing industry if necessary for the costs they may incur like in the perfect case of the airlines and the altimeters in terms of upgrading that technology.
And Joe, if I could just jump in on that, and Larry, I think alluded to this. The C-band auction raised $80 billion. $14 billion and more went to the satellite. Those are satellite incumbent interests. That was all worked out. It took some negotiating. There was some political issues involved, but that more than compensated the satellite incumbents. And had these technical interference issues been raised sooner, the costs, and we're still learning exactly what we think the costs of upgrading the aviation altimeters would be. But it sure sounds like it would be a rounding error compared to the amount of money that was spent on the Spectrum. That wouldn't have solved all the problems because there's the timing issue. But had everyone been aware of the issue and the scope of the issue, that could have been worked in. Congress gets to decide how that money gets spent when it goes to the Treasury. But there can be these negotiations on the side, as there were with the satellite interest in this case. And then a few years ago, when the broadcasters realigned their spectrum, this was written into legislation, but they were paid for their efforts, a private sector industry, but that was legislated. It doesn't have to be legislated. That can make it easier. That can also make it harder in some cases. But those dollars, would have been there had everyone sort of been aware of the challenges at the onset of the process.
Yeah, I think good points. I think that's we're sort of transitioning into talking about, I guess, notice is always at the top of mind in these discussions of like, when do we know what we need to do? And then the studies on like, is there going to be a problem? What kind of problem is it? And then the more we know about that, the more we can say, okay, here's how we fix the problem and here's who's going to pay for it. And so I guess, I think in this case, we can argue about whether it was 30 days. I think like there's evidence going back to like 2016 or so of the aviation industry knowing about this. But going forward, I think we're sort of looking at getting more of these studies that have more agreed upon assumptions. And I guess a question for I guess Jennifer, we can start with you on this of who should be doing those studies. Should we looking to more like independent bodies instead of industry going back and forth, or sort of industry but having a better standard for the FCC to evaluate who's right and who's wrong? Or how do you look at that?
I'm still back on the 2016. Yes, we go back to 2016 of aviation saying, hey, this is a concern.
Yeah. So I guess that goes to the question, like what's the difference between saying we have a concern and saying here is our concern and here's how you can fix it for us and here's how much time we need, that kind of thing.
I feel like Congress is really good at directing studies.
Okay.
Right. So there are some things that we could do that would, if the concern is that you need a wholly independent study to be done, there are not a lot of test capabilities in the world that test aviation equipment, right, to what we call environmental testing. I think it's DO 356. So in terms of the environment testing and that type of thing, the lab is the lab, right? So whether Boeing takes it to a lab to go do the environment testing versus, AT&T or Telecom taking it to the lab, right? There's only a certain number that you're going to be able to go to. I think where we need to get the right people in the room from both the telecom and from the aviation industry is when the results come out. And that's where I think the studies are really important. We had our study, and then I think there was a telecom study that came out. Until we put the engineers in the room to understand the assumptions that went into each one, my understanding is that it only took about 3 weeks for the engineers to be like, oh, that's what you meant, or on either side, and to come to an agreement of, okay, now we see what the problem is. But getting those people in the room, that was a real struggle. It was really a struggle to get people in the room to say, well, no, that's my intellectual property, right? I'm holding on to this like it's, my firstborn. And I think that type of, so I don't really think it's about who conducts the study. This is Jen's opinion, right? I don't think it's about like who conducts the study. I think it's about getting the right people in the room and making it, and as managers, as executives, making the right people available to have the conversation. Because it doesn't do me any bit of good to have this conversation with you guys. I need my technical fellows in the room with the technical, the really smart technical people at the telecom, so they can have the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's something we heard throughout this whole process is that when the engineers get in a room, they can't help but figure it out. We can't help but say like we have to optimize our trade-offs here.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we talk about in the paper is like how do we get more of these people, both talking to each other between agencies, and just hiring the right engineers in the government. And I guess looking at sort of that personnel front, I don't know, Tom, if you have experience with who's talking to each other when we have a successful spectrum reallocation.
One of the challenges is just getting the right personnel in the agencies. And it's interesting having grown up as a telecom lawyer, mainly in this city, going into the FCC or the NTIA or on the Hill as a young lawyer. It does nothing but increase your career opportunities. I think for engineers, it's a little bit different. The work that the engineers are doing is kind of the same, whether you're at NTIA or the FCC or at Boeing, but the private sector pays better. And so when I talk to my friends at NTIA or the FCC, they put their finger on this as they're having a really hard time attracting that talent. They have great people, they just don't have enough of them. And then, of course, you get into the funding issues as well, too. But I think that is one area where all of the agencies could use some help, would be more resources to hire more of the very talented people they have.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? I would also say that in this particular area, in spectrum management and the engineering behind it, it is a niche skill. At least within aviation, it's really a niche skill. And having the people get those skills it's a challenge, like, to go hire them, because I'll tell you what, Amazon and all of the startups, they want them too. And so I think that as spectrum use continues to grow and we continue to figure out how to eke more efficiency out of spectrum use, more and more companies are going to say, well, I need a spectrum expert, or I need an engineer who can make the widget that's going to work within this band. And that continues to put pressure on the system, because there's just not enough people who understand spectrum and understand its use from a receiver perspective. That's been the workforce issue, I think, has been a really big challenge.
Yeah. I sometimes think about it in terms of, like, it seems expensive to say we should pay all these engineers a lot more, but look at how expensive it was to not do that and not get them in the room. Larry, you have any thoughts on personnel? Who should we be hiring and relying on within this process?
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is an issue that applies in so many sectors of industry today. It's not just a spectrum question. I've been doing a lot of thinking and working on how to implement the broadband legislation that came out of the Infrastructure Act. And you're dealing with the same exact issue, although maybe at a less skilled level. But, there's now $50 billion or $40 billion that NTIA has to have broadband built, in addition to all the money coming from the FCC and the Treasury Department. And the fact of the matter is that there's a huge shortage of labor to go out and build those projects. So throughout the telecom industry and throughout industry generally, I think we're looking at significant labor shortages that and I don't think there's one solution for spectrum that's going to work when you're dealing with these larger questions of where are people in the workforce, and how do you get people interested in these occupations, because there's just about any occupation out there is looking for people right now and looking for people with training. And it's a huge, huge issue. And I think many of the grand ambitions of some of the legislation in the last couple of years is potentially jeopardized or at least potentially delayed in terms of finding people to actually build these projects and to engage in the work that's necessary to make these successful outcomes.
Yeah, I think good point. We're going to go to audience Q&A in just a second, so get your questions ready. I want to say just as quickly, where do we stand now with these sort of, I guess for those in the room who might not know, it's not completely all resolved yet, right? We still have the mitigation measures in place around certain airports, and those are still voluntarily agreed to by the wireless companies. And there's a July deadline coming up, and then there's another deadline for when all the airplanes are supposed to have upgraded their altimeters. So where do we stand with that? Can we have an optimistic take here, or are we still in trouble?
I think we might still be in trouble.
Okay.
And part of that is it's just I mean, there's many sectors, right? So getting through the certification activities, right, is the first thing that comes to my mind, is just getting through all the paperwork. There are on Boeing aircraft, right? I think we're looking at 7 different radio altimeters that are still in flight across all of our products. And so, either looking to do a part swap, right? So do the suppliers have, please don't quote me on the 7, by the way, I can get you a real number for those of you who are writing on this. So there are some airlines that are going to have to do a full scale part swap, right? So it's the radio altimeter that they have cannot be upgraded with the use of what we call inline filters. So they're going to get a new radio altimeter. And then there are going to be radio altimeters that are okay, but they have to go put what we call these inline filters. All of that has to be certified by the FAA, right? So, or EASA has to be accepted by the European Aviation Safety Agency. And then Airbus has the same thing. Embraer has the same thing. So when we look at just the grand scale of all of this, I think we do have some concerns that July is still sporty. So we're working as fast as we can. I believe we have solutions for every single one. All of the radio altimeters, it's just the time and the rotation of getting them onto airplanes that's concerning to everybody. And I recognize that's got to be one of the most frustrating things for the telecom industry to hear, is that it really is taking a lot of, I think, more time.
I was going to give a slightly more optimistic view, but now I can't.
I think they're trying.
Yeah, no. It really, the relationships have gotten very good. I will say, though, a further complication that we haven't talked about, the C-band is 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz. The auction was of spectrum from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. So that left 220 megahertz of spectrum between where 5G would be and where the altimeters are. And there's a debate over the sufficiency of that. We think it is. The airline folks disagree. But the deployment of spectrum into the C-band is in 2 steps. So right now, everything we're talking about only goes up to 3.8 gigahertz. And then later this year, the phase 2 is supposed to kick in, and that would allow the deployments from 3.8 up to 3.98. So that makes it even more challenging.
Yes.
I did want to talk about one other aspect we haven't touched on, if I could just take a minute.
Yes.
There are other entities involved in solving these problems. We talked about the NTIA and their role. They convene something called the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee, the IRAC, which is all the agencies with equities with spectrum, which is basically all the agencies. And they meet, at least when I was at OSTP, they met every 2 weeks. We'd have a 3-hour meeting every Friday morning with a big cup of coffee to dig into the nitty gritty of this stuff. So all the agencies are there. The FCC is there, OMB. And that is one area where issues like this are supposed to be aired. I was not around for this process, and I do wonder whether it wasn't explored as it might have been, because it was not federal spectrum. It was the aviation spectrum, not FAA spectrum. It was spectrum licensed to the aviation industry. So the FAA probably didn't have exactly the same perspective they might have had it been, as often when we deal with the Defense Department, it's assigned to the Defense Department. That's one issue. The second issue is there's a broader framework for all this, which is at the international level. Jennifer talked about the ICAO on the industry side, on the aviation side. There are international standards bodies for telecom. There's also a UN body, the International Telecommunication Union, that tries to harmonize spectrum worldwide. And that's so that phones and airplanes can operate consistently around the world, which is, of course, a huge benefit for the industries involved, and then ultimately for consumers, because you get the benefits of scale that reduce costs and makes it so that the planes can fly everywhere and you can take your phone everywhere. And on the timing issue, I would say it was 20 years ago when the ITU first started talking about the possibility of reallocating the C-band or some of the C-band to mobile broadband. The U.S. was on board with that. I don't know exactly when the ITU acts in stages. But the FCC didn't create this out of whole cloth. It was being discussed and studied at the ITU level for years before the FCC got engaged on it. And there's a big the ITU conference is coming up this November. They meet about every 3 to 4 years, and it's a very important opportunity for us to help drive harmonized spectrum in a way that serves the interests, particularly of American interests abroad. But when we're having challenges like this domestically, it is not a great sign for going into the ITU. So these ramifications, when we can't figure things out domestically, it spills over into the ITU process, and that opens the door for countries like China and others to try to put their vision of how these things should be ordered into place. So another challenge in this whole process.
Yeah, it's complexities on complexities
Yes.
here. Yeah. All right, so I think we can take questions. There's a microphone in the room that Jess has, I believe. So if you have a question, raise your hand. If not, they've been pouring in online. Yes.
Oh, wow, that was quick. My name's Corey Noble. I handle telecom issues for Congressman Posey of Florida, who represents the Kennedy Space Center. And so we have a saying in our office: we sell space every day in every way. And so there are stakeholders in the commercial space realm that care very much about spectrum allocation as well. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to a few of those, and then also, Tom, I think the concern for China sort of co-opting international standards setting bodies is really a big thing. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah. I want to take that. Thanks.
This is not my area of expertise, man. I mean, so I think when you look at commercial space, you look at commercial airplanes, right? I mean, the idea of spectrum is fairly well translated, right? So if in commercial space, the spectrum that's being used is similarly has these similar issues, right? You're going to have the same type of safety concerns. Now, I'm not as familiar with the regulatory space. Sorry, no pun intended. I'm not as familiar with the regulatory framework for commercial space as I am with commercial aviation. So I can't really speak to that piece of it. But I have friends that could come and talk to you about it if you want to know more.
Yeah, these are all very kind of case specific. The satellite folks have been at it a lot longer just because it is by definition international, and they have been a lot more focused for a longer period of time, say at the ITU. We're running into it though now as you see demand for mobile broadband increase, the data usage is increasing. So we're getting more and more, our appetite for spectrum is growing and growing, and that's why we run into these challenges, including with the space folks.
Yeah, the whole satellite spectrum is a whole other parallel universe that we can do another event on.
Next study.
Yeah. Anyone else in the room? Yeah.
How much of, Slate Herman, Energy and Commerce Committee Majority Staff. How much of the C-band issue do you believe is due to spectrum sharing growing pains versus this being a completely novel issue for the C-band? Basically, the next time a road bump comes up in spectrum sharing, do you think we'll be able to apply these lessons or not?
I'll start there because first off, why do you think it's a spectrum sharing issue?
Because there's two unless I'm not understanding the issue correctly, there's two users in bands next to each other that are having issues with one another.
Yeah, but that's not sharing. At least that's not what we traditionally call sharing. Sharing is when we are talking about having entities share the same spectrum band and then figure out how they operate when they're both using the same spectrum. And at the federal level, that's happening all the time. Remember, I mentioned that annually the NTIA processes 90,000 applications for spectrum from federal agencies. If you look at virtually every band of spectrum that's allocated for federal use, you will probably find nearly every cabinet agency using some level amount of spectrum within that band. And the sharing is handled by the fact that these are geographically isolated uses. So somebody maybe having a tower in Utah is not going to interfere with a different agency that's got a tower that there or some kind of facility in North Carolina. So that's all managed at the NTIA level. And that is spectrum sharing technically, although it's divided by either time of day or geography or that sort of thing. What we're dealing with C-band and what we were dealing with Legato and GPS was services that were in adjacent or nearby bands where the concern was that emissions from one band were interfering potentially with equipment in the other, or as Tom mentioned, maybe it was because the equipment in the other band wasn't really limited to the spectrum it had been assigned, and so it was picking up potential interference from totally legal uses of the spectrum holder in the band they were in. So, and in fact, even that gets complicated because in the case of GPS, where I think everybody acknowledged that GPS receivers were in effect taking advantage of adjacent spectrum that they hadn't been authorized to utilize, it absolutely improved the accuracy and the usability of GPS. So it was a good thing that the GPS receivers were able to take advantage of that. But then you think about moving a service like the Legato service into that band, and then all of a sudden the GPS receivers can't work the way they had been designed because they were taking advantage of the fact that they had spectrum next to them that wasn't being utilized. I don't call that a sharing issue necessarily. It's much more one of how do you define the equities in terms of who bears the responsibility at that point for avoiding interference that may be taking place because of people not rigorously sticking to the spectrum that they were licensed to actually utilize.
But I think it is a good question in terms of would this happen again? I guess if we could do it all over again with what we've learned, and maybe we are. There's talk of allocating the 4.4 gigahertz band, the one right above radio altimeters. Like, where would we be in that case?
I guess at one level, one of my concerns is that we not overreact to what happened in the C-band.
Mhm.
It was certainly a setback all around and a lot of wasted time and money and all that. But having seen this process work successfully, I think we've got the right mechanisms set up, and I wouldn't want to see an overreaction to what was certainly something that needs to be fixed. I think a lot of the recommendations in the report are what I would say are somewhat softer recommendations, right? Like fixing the spectrum relocation fund, making sure there's just more communication at the right time between agencies and between industries. And this is how it has worked for decades. And we just need to get back to that. I think a White House engagement to really help manage that process is really important. The problem is that one of the problems is that when the decision is made, whoever is aggrieved is going to always want to litigate it some more. And at some point it's got to end. And you need some kind of mechanism that doesn't invite folks to keep litigating it, but that brings it to resolution. And it has worked well in the past. I don't know. There's no magic silver bullet to solve it, but I would hate to see an overreaction that then introduces even more complexity.
I think on our end, so aviation radio altimeters is a protected band. So it's aviation spectrum, as we talked about earlier. On our end, I think, we have kicked off, and this has been a couple of years now, new standards making for radio altimeters that aren't just considering the C-band. It is going beyond that, right? It is looking at the top to ensure that if we start to see spectrum use on top of our band, right? So right now we're on the bottom coming up, right? Top coming down, that we are creating or that we're implementing radio altimeters on our aircraft that are robust and will not be listening outside the assigned band, the band that we're assigned to. I think that there are concerns about GPS. I think there's concerns about the traffic collision and avoidance system, TCAS. I think if you go and you talk to the FAA and the air traffic controllers, they're going to tell you that they've got concerns 10 years out on something else. There's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am on this, but I can already tell you that people have approached either me or somebody else and they've said, what if we did this in 10 years time? Are we ready for that? And I think that's the piece that I want to see us take out of this whole experience, is that now if we do have that time, then what do we do with it? Right. So we aren't fighting in that, 18 months before the auction actually is announced and happens. I hope that makes sense. Right. So there are definitely areas that we see as risk from a spectrum management perspective, and being able to all play nicely in the sandbox together.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Anyone else? Okay. We have time for maybe a couple from online. I think there's one asking, the White House and NTIA officials come and go. How do you ensure continuity across administrations? I don't know. Is that a Larry question to start with, or somebody else?
Well, yes, the political appointees come and go, but I think within the agencies, at least until recently, and I think even, I don't want to overstate this because I don't have personal knowledge of this, although it's been my sense that the last 4 or 5 years have seen a lot of people taking retirement, leaving agencies. So the people who did this for 20 or 30 years, I think a lot of those people have been leaving because they get to retirement age and it's like, okay, time to go. I mean, at the time I was at NTIA, particularly in our spectrum office, I think fully well over half, maybe as high as 75% of the people in that office were either retirement eligible or were going to become retirement eligible during the Obama administration. So I think that's a huge issue. But if you have continuity at the associate administrator level, there's no reason why you can't get these processes and procedures put in place and see them carry forward administration. Again, I think maybe we had an aberration for a few years from a few years ago. I think we're seeing NTIA now kind of coming back and saying we see that these processes are important and we're going to put them in place, and hopefully those will be things that can carry forward even as the political leadership comes and goes.
I would just add, elections certainly have consequences, but in this is one area where continuity shouldn't be up for debate, right? I mean, these are mainly technical issues. We want a vibrant economy driven by 5G. We want our airlines to be safe. This is not healthcare, or immigration, or taxes, right? These should be agreed upon principles. So I don't think there's like a change in policy that comes about on any of those issues. It's just getting it right.
You don't have to.
I was going to say, I thought the question was NTIA and White House and FCC, not the FAA. So I was like, sweet, not it.
Yeah, that's okay.
I would like a confirmed FAA administrator, please.
Fair enough. Okay. I wonder, maybe you don't have time for another full question, but is there anything that anyone would like to say in closing in terms of thoughts on the general state of spectrum allocation policy? Where would you like to go? Otherwise, I can go to a hard-hitting question in here.
Oh, go to your hard-hitting question.
Okay. Well, there's one about the letter that NTIA never forwarded to the FCC. Apparently, anyone have thoughts on that?
I really don't know any of those
they get really
circumstances
specific.
around that.
This is why you have to come in person so you can ask follow-up questions. Jennifer, someone wants to clarify, should radio altimeters be subject to receiver standards adopted by the FCC?
Yeah, well, we kind of hit on that earlier.
Yeah.
Certainly the idea of making sure that there is some understanding of how the receivers will perform and that they won't be either interfered with or be listening into the same
Yeah,
gray
and
area we
and
talked
I don't
about.
want to like commit RTCA or SAE to something, right? That's not my role, but I will say that there needs to be experts who are putting together these standards that are having conversations with people at the FCC, if that makes any sense at all, right? I mean, in terms of standards being defined and the FAA adopting those standards as good for compliance, I mean, I guess I see a world in which that could happen, but traditionally and right now, those standards are created by organizations that are not the FCC. So I think the question is, in my opinion, right, does the FCC need a voice in the creation of those standards? And I don't see why not. It's just, it's one more thing for people to have to support, for your technical experts to go be part of, and let's make sure that we've got a priority on getting that work done.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a good place to end, is everyone getting together, sharing information and
Yes.
cooperating early on in the process and planning ahead. So with that, I think let's thank our panelists and we'll call it a day. Thank you all.